March 24, 1945, 30,000 feet above Berlin. The largest bombing raid of the war is underway. Over 1,600 American bombers push deep into Nazi Germany, protected by fighter escorts. Among them, a squadron of P-51 Mustangs with distinctive red tails cuts through the sky. German interceptors rise to meet them. Messerschmitt 262 jet fighters, the fastest aircraft in the world, streak toward the formation. The Luftwaffe pilots have orders: destroy the bombers at any cost. They've heard about these red-tailed fighters. Some German pilots dismissed them. Some laughed. That laughter died in the sky over Germany. By the time the mission ends, the red tails will have shot down 3 German jets and escorted every single bomber home safely. Not one bomber lost. The men flying those red-tailed Mustangs are the Tuskegee Airmen, and this is their story. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. America enters World War II. Within weeks, thousands of young men rush to recruiting stations, eager to fight for their country. But if you were black in 1941 America, the military had a different message. You can serve, but not as equals. The United States military was completely segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to service roles: cooks, laborers, stevedores. The idea of black combat pilots was considered absurd by military leadership. Army Air Corps officials believed and publicly stated that Negroes lacked the intelligence, coordination, and courage required for aerial combat. But here's where it gets interesting. Pressure was building. Civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and progressive politicians demanded change. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt championed the cause. In 1939, Congress had passed the Civilian Pilot Training Act, and black colleges had lobbied for inclusion. The military faced a choice: open flight training to black Americans or face political consequences. In 1941, the War Department created an experiment. They would train black pilots, but separately in the segregated South. If the experiment failed as many expected it would, the military could point to empirical evidence that black men couldn't fly combat aircraft. If it succeeded, well, few believed that would happen. The location chosen was Tuskegee, Alabama, deep in the segregated South. Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university, had aviation facilities. The town had an airfield. It was isolated enough that white communities wouldn't protest too loudly, and crucially, it kept black aviation training far from white flight schools. The program began with enormous skepticism. White officers assigned to Tuskegee often viewed it as career exile. Southern newspapers mocked the idea of Negro pilots. Even some military officials hoped the program would fail quietly, proving their prejudices correct. The men selected for training knew they weren't just learning to fly. They were fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against Nazi Germany, one against American racism. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. The first class of cadets arrived at Tuskegee in July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor. They faced training standards deliberately set higher than white pilot programs. Instructors watched for any excuse to wash them out. The base itself was segregated. Black cadets couldn't enter the white officers' club, couldn't use certain facilities, faced constant discrimination even as they trained to defend their country. But what the architects of this experiment didn't anticipate was the caliber of men who would volunteer. Many had college degrees, unusual for any pilot candidates of that era. They included teachers, engineers, athletes, musicians. Men like Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of the Army's first black general, a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of silence from racist classmates. Men like Charles DeBow, a Howard University graduate. Men like Lee Archer, who would become one of the war's top fighter aces. These men understood the stakes. If they failed, it would set back black advancement in the military for generations. If they succeeded, they would open doors for thousands of others. The pressure was immense, the expectations impossibly high, and the odds were stacked against them by design. In March 1942, the first 5 cadets graduated, receiving their silver pilot wings. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., led this inaugural class. The experiment had produced pilots, but could they fight? Would they be sent to combat, or would they be relegated to training roles, their skills wasted? The experiment declared a qualified success but kept from the real test of war. The U.S. Army Air Forces had created these black fighter pilots. Now they had to decide what to do with them. And in that decision lay the future of military integration and the course of the civil rights movement itself. To understand the Tuskegee Airmen, we need to go back to 1925, when the U.S. Army War College published a study titled The Use of Negro Manpower in War. The report concluded that Black Americans were inherently inferior soldiers, lacking courage, intelligence, and leadership ability. This document became official military doctrine. It shaped policy for nearly 2 decades. By 1940, the U.S. military had approximately 5,000 black soldiers out of a total force of 230,000. Not a single black pilot existed in the Army Air Corps. Not one. Black Americans who applied for flight training were rejected automatically. The official position was clear. Black men simply couldn't handle the complex mental and physical demands of flying combat aircraft. This wasn't just Southern prejudice. It was institutional policy backed by supposedly scientific studies. Military psychologists had conducted tests claiming to prove racial differences in reaction time, spatial reasoning, and decision-making ability. These junk studies, accepted as fact, locked Black Americans out of aviation entirely. But the problem ran deeper than just pilot training. Even if black men could fly and activists insisted they could, where would they serve? Military units were segregated by law. White pilots wouldn't fly alongside black pilots. White bomber crews wouldn't accept black escort fighters. The entire military structure was built on racial separation, reinforced by regulations, tradition, and the Jim Crow laws of the era. The stakes were enormous. As Nazi Germany conquered Europe and Japan expanded across Asia, America needed pilots desperately. The Army Air Corps was expanding from a few hundred pilots to tens of thousands. But qualified black applicants were turned away while the military struggled to find enough white candidates. The waste of human resources was staggering. Black leaders understood what was at stake. If black Americans couldn't serve in combat roles, particularly in the prestigious, modern, technical field of aviation, they would remain second-class citizens after the war. Military service had historically been a path to advancement for immigrant groups. Irish, Italian, and Jewish Americans had used military service to gain acceptance, but that path was blocked for black Americans. The NAACP, the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, and other civil rights organizations launched a campaign. The Double V campaign: victory over fascism abroad, victory over racism at home. They argued that America couldn't credibly fight Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial oppression. The hypocrisy was glaring. Pressure mounted throughout 1940. A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened to organize a march on Washington with 100,000 black protesters. President Franklin Roosevelt, facing re-election and needing black votes, couldn't afford the political embarrassment. The administration needed a compromise. In September 1940, the War Department announced it would accept black applicants for pilot training, but in segregated units. It was the minimum concession possible. Training would occur separately. Units would be all black, commanded by white officers initially. Combat assignments would be determined later. The policy satisfied no one but diffused the immediate crisis. Then came the critical question: where to train these pilots? Northern bases faced potential integration conflicts. Southern bases offered segregation but risked violent resistance from local whites opposed to any advancement for black Americans. The solution was Tuskegee, a black institution in the South, isolated, where an all-black program could operate with minimal white contact. What military leaders viewed as a containment strategy, black leaders saw as an opportunity. If black pilots could succeed in combat, if they could match or exceed white pilots in skill and courage, the entire edifice of military segregation would be undermined. One successful black fighter squadron could accomplish more for civil rights than 100 protest marches. But the solution would come from an unexpected place: a group of determined men who refused to accept America's limitations on their potential. Enter Tuskegee Army Airfield, constructed specifically for this experiment. The base opened in July 1941 on 1,600 acres of Alabama farmland. Unlike established air bases with years of infrastructure and tradition, Tuskegee was built from scratch, a deliberate isolation that would become both obstacle and opportunity. The program's architect was Colonel Noel Parrish, a white officer from Kentucky who would prove crucial to the program's success. Parrish believed the experiment should succeed on its merits. He fought against artificially inflated standards designed to produce failure. He insisted black cadets receive the same training white pilots received, no more, no less. His position was controversial among fellow white officers who expected him to maintain appropriate racial attitudes. The training philosophy was straightforward but brutally difficult. Primary flight training in Stearman PT-17 biplanes, basic training in BT-13 Valiants, advanced training in AT-6 Texans, then transition to combat aircraft, initially P-40 Warhawks. The same progression white pilots followed, compressed into an intensive program that produced combat-ready pilots in less than a year. But here's where things got complicated. The program faced sabotage, both subtle and overt. Some white instructors openly stated they wouldn't train black pilots. Replacement instructors had to be found. Equipment deliveries were mysteriously delayed. Maintenance support was inadequate. The base received lower priority for fuel, spare parts, and ammunition. Every bureaucratic obstacle that could be placed in the program's path appeared. Charles Alfred Anderson, known as Chief, became the program's chief flight instructor. Anderson was already a legendary figure in black aviation. He'd earned his pilot's license in 1929 and logged thousands of flight hours when most Americans had never seen an airplane up close. His credibility was unassailable. When Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee in 1941 and insisted on flying with Anderson despite Secret Service objections, the resulting photograph of a black pilot flying the First Lady became a powerful symbol. The cadets themselves exceeded every expectation. The first class, which began training in July 1941, consisted of 13 men. Only 5 graduated in March 1942, but that 38% pass rate was actually higher than some white aviation cadet classes. These men, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Lemuel Custis, Charles DeBow, George Roberts, and Mac Ross, became the foundation of what would grow into the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. The training regimen was deliberately punishing, 6 days a week from dawn until after dark. Ground school covering navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, gunnery, tactics, physical conditioning that pushed men to their limits. Flight training where a single mistake could mean washout. The pressure was relentless, intentional, designed to break those who couldn't handle combat conditions. Living conditions added another layer of hardship. The base was segregated even within itself. Black officers couldn't enter the white officers' club. They built their own using their own money. They couldn't shop in nearby towns where Jim Crow laws enforced strict separation. They faced hostility from local whites who resented their presence. Some were beaten in town. Others faced threats. The Ku Klux Klan maintained a visible presence in the area. Yet the program expanded. By late 1942, Tuskegee was graduating a new class every 5 weeks. The 99th Fighter Squadron reached full strength. The 332nd Fighter Group formed, eventually comprising 4 squadrons, the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd. Over 900 pilots would eventually earn their wings at Tuskegee, along with navigators, bombardiers, and support personnel. The aircraft they trained on reflected America's military priorities. Early classes flew P-40 Warhawks, a capable but aging fighter. Later classes would transition to P-39 Airacobras and P-47 Thunderbolts. Eventually, they would receive the aircraft that would make them legendary, the P-51 Mustang, painted with distinctive red tails that would become their trademark. However, what happened during the first test flight would shock everyone involved. The first Tuskegee-trained pilots took to the skies in combat aircraft in late 1942, but not over enemy territory. They flew training missions over Alabama, honing skills that white military officials still doubted they possessed. The 99th Fighter Squadron, now fully manned and trained, waited for deployment orders that were suspiciously slow to arrive. The delay was deliberate. Military leadership debated what to do with these black pilots. Some argued they should remain stateside as trainers, never seeing combat. Others suggested they be assigned to coastal defense, a safe, low-priority role where failure wouldn't impact the war effort. The idea of sending them into actual combat against the Luftwaffe terrified commanders who feared both their potential failure and their potential success. But you won't believe what happened during this waiting period. The pilots used the time to train beyond standard requirements. They flew more hours than required. They practiced formation flying until it became second nature. They studied aerial tactics obsessively. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., now commanding the 99th, drove his men relentlessly. He understood that when they finally got their chance, they would need to be not just good, but exceptional. The modification to their mission profile came not through military planning, but through political pressure. In early 1943, the Pittsburgh Courier and other black newspapers demanded to know why trained combat pilots were sitting idle in Alabama while the war raged overseas. The NAACP questioned whether the military ever intended to use these pilots in combat or if the entire program was a cynical political gesture. In April 1943, the orders finally came. The 99th Fighter Squadron would deploy to North Africa, joining the Allied campaign in the Mediterranean theater. It was a calculated decision. North Africa was a secondary front compared to the massive air war over Europe. If the 99th failed, the impact on overall strategy would be minimal. If they succeeded, they'd be far from the spotlight of the European theater. The pilots of the 99th arrived in Morocco on April 24, 1943. They expected combat immediately. Instead, they faced 6 weeks of additional training and integration into the 33rd Fighter Group, a white unit. White pilots looked at them with open skepticism. Some refused to fly alongside them. Others made it clear they expected the black pilots to fail, washing out or dying in combat, proving the military's racist assumptions correct. The aircraft they flew were hand-me-downs. The 99th received P-40 Warhawks that white squadrons had already used and partially worn out. Maintenance was substandard. Spare parts were scarce. The message was clear. Even in combat, they were second priority. Every disadvantage the military could impose without being overtly discriminatory was put in place. Living conditions reflected this same prejudice. Black pilots were housed separately from white pilots. They ate in separate mess facilities. They couldn't enter white officers' clubs. In the middle of a war against Nazi racial ideology, the U.S. military maintained strict racial segregation even in combat zones. The irony was not lost on the men of the 99th. Davis faced another challenge: inexperience. Most white fighter squadrons had veterans who'd flown combat in Europe or the Pacific. The 99th had none. Every pilot was a rookie. They would learn aerial combat by doing it with no mentors, no experienced pilots to draw from. The learning curve would be steep, and mistakes in combat are often fatal. The squadron's first mission came on June 2, 1943. Their assignment: provide fighter cover for Allied bombers striking Pantelleria, a small Italian island in the Mediterranean. It was a relatively safe mission designed to ease the 99th into combat. No enemy fighters appeared. The mission was a success, but it proved nothing. The real test was still ahead. But its real test was about to come in actual combat. July 2, 1943, Sicily. The 99th Fighter Squadron flew escort for Allied dive bombers attacking the harbor at Castelvetrano. This time, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. German fighters dove from altitude, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, some of the best fighter aircraft in the world flown by experienced combat pilots. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall spotted 2 FW-190s climbing toward the bomber formation. He banked his P-40 hard, diving to intercept. The German pilots saw him coming but didn't break off. Perhaps they'd heard about these new American pilots and wanted to test them. Hall closed to 200 yards and opened fire. His 6.50 caliber machine guns converged on the lead FW-190. The German fighter burst into flames and spun toward the Mediterranean below. The radio exploded with calls. I got him, I got him." Hall's wingman confirmed the kill. It was the first aerial victory for the Tuskegee Airmen. When Hall landed back at base, he was mobbed by his squadron mates. Lieutenant Colonel Davis shook his hand but kept the celebration brief. One kill proved nothing. The skeptics would need more. And the skeptics were loud. Time magazine published an article questioning the 99th's combat effectiveness, citing unnamed Army Air Forces sources claiming the black pilots lacked aggression and fighting spirit. The article pointed out that while Hall had scored a kill, the overall kill ratio for the 99th was lower than white squadrons. What the article failed to mention was that the 99th was flying inferior aircraft, had no combat-experienced pilots, and was being assigned missions that limited opportunities for aerial combat. But here's where it gets interesting. The controversy reached Congress. Southern congressmen used the Time article as evidence that the Negro pilot experiment had failed and should be terminated. They argued for disbanding the 99th and ending the Tuskegee program entirely. A congressional investigation was launched. The future of black military aviation hung in the balance. Lieutenant Colonel Davis was recalled to Washington to testify. In September 1943, he stood before a congressional committee and dismantled every criticism methodically. He explained the squadron's limited opportunities for combat. He detailed the inferior equipment they'd been assigned. He presented statistics showing the 99th Bomber Protection rate matched or exceeded white squadrons. His testimony was calm, factual, and devastating to his critics. Meanwhile, back in Sicily and then Italy, the 99th kept flying. August 1943 saw them supporting the invasion of Sicily. They flew strafing missions, ground attack runs, and bomber escorts. The missions were dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, and German fighters remained a constant threat. On August 24th, the 99th engaged a formation of German bombers attacking Allied positions. They shot down 3 Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers without losing a single aircraft. The pilots learned quickly. They developed tactics tailored to their P-40's strength, superior diving speed, and rugged construction. They learned to use altitude advantage, diving through German formations, striking fast, then using their speed to escape before the more maneuverable Bf-109s could respond. It wasn't the dogfighting white pilots preferred, but it was effective. By October 1943, the 99th had flown over 500 combat missions. They destroyed enemy aircraft, bombed ground targets, and protected Allied forces. More importantly, they'd proved something the military establishment had denied was possible. Black pilots could fight as effectively as white pilots when given equal equipment and opportunities. The congressional investigation quietly concluded without recommending disbandment. The Tuskegee program would continue. The 332nd Fighter Group, with 3 more squadrons of black pilots, was preparing to deploy. The 99th had kicked open a door. Now others would follow through it. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status. By early 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen were at the height of their power. The 332nd Fighter Group, now at full strength with 4 squadrons, deployed to Italy. They painted their aircraft tails bright red, initially for squadron identification, but the distinctive marking would become their trademark. Bomber crews began requesting those red tail angels for escort duty. The reason was simple: the red tails brought bombers home. The 332nd's mission was bomber escort, protecting B-17 and B-24 formations during deep penetration raids into Germany and occupied Europe. This was the most important, most dangerous fighter mission of the war. German fighters focused everything on destroying bombers before they reached their targets. Escort fighters had to keep them away while also watching for jet fighters, flak, and other threats. Captain Joseph Ellsbury became one of the group's top aces during this period. On July 12, 1944, while escorting bombers to southern France, Ellsbury's flight encountered a formation of German fighters. In a matter of minutes, Ellsbury shot down 3 Bf-109s. His wingmen accounted for 2 more. The engagement showcased everything the Red Tails had learned: teamwork, aggressive tactics, and superior gunnery. But here's what made the 332nd different: their mission philosophy. Most white fighter groups prioritized kills. Pilots who shot down enemy aircraft became aces, received medals, gained fame. The 332nd prioritized the bombers. If that meant staying with the formation instead of chasing Germans for kills, they stayed. If that meant avoiding combat unless bombers were directly threatened, they avoided it. This discipline was controversial among some fighter pilots, but loved by bomber crews. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. Between June and August 1944, during the height of the strategic bombing campaign, the 332nd flew 200 bomber escort missions. Their loss rate was the lowest of any escort group in the 15th Air Force. Bomber crews noticed. They requested red tails whenever possible. White bomber crews who'd never interacted with black Americans learned to trust the men in those red-tailed Mustangs with their lives. Lieutenant Lee Archer became another ace during this period. On October 12, 1944, during a mission over Greece, Archer engaged multiple German aircraft, shooting down 3 in a single engagement. His wingman, Lieutenant Wendell Prout, shot down 3 more. Together, they destroyed 6 enemy aircraft in one mission, a feat that made headlines even in mainstream white newspapers. The statistics tell the story of their excellence. By late 1944, the 332nd had flown over 1,500 bomber escort missions. They'd engaged German fighters hundreds of times. Their bomber loss rate was consistently among the lowest in theater. But the numbers don't capture what this meant. Every bomber that made it home carried 10 men. The Red Tails weren't just shooting down enemy aircraft. They were saving American lives, mission after mission. The respect they earned was hard-won but real. White bomber crews wrote letters praising their escorts. Some crews painted tributes to the Red Tails on their aircraft. Generals who'd opposed black pilots now cited the 332nd as a model unit. The military establishment that had predicted failure now pointed to the Tuskegee Airmen as proof that integration could work. The Germans noticed too. Luftwaffe pilots learned to recognize the Red Tails and knew they faced skilled, disciplined opponents. Some German pilots in post-war interviews expressed respect for the Red Tails' abilities. The laughter and dismissal that some Germans initially showed had evaporated. Now there was only respect earned through combat. By January 1945, the 332nd had achieved something unprecedented. They demolished the myth of black inferiority through undeniable combat success. But every legend has its darkest moment. Despite their success, the Tuskegee Airmen weren't invincible. Combat over Europe was brutal, and the Red Tails paid a heavy price. Between 1943 and 1945, 66 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. Another 32 became prisoners of war after being shot down over enemy territory. These weren't statistics. They were husbands, fathers, sons, friends. The loss of Captain Armour McDaniel on July 18, 1944, hit the 332nd particularly hard. McDaniel, one of the original Tuskegee cadets, was escorting bombers when his P-51 was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Austria. His wingman watched him bail out successfully, but McDaniel was never heard from again. He was later confirmed killed, either dying from his wounds or executed by Germans after capture. The physical dangers were compounded by the racism that followed them even into combat. When Red Tail pilots were shot down and captured, they faced additional dangers as black prisoners of war. German propaganda sometimes singled them out for special humiliation. Some were separated from white POWs. Others faced questions about their inferior, American treatment, with Germans attempting to exploit American racism for propaganda purposes. Back at base, segregation continued. Even after risking their lives protecting white bomber crews, Red Tail pilots returned to segregated facilities. They couldn't eat with white pilots. They couldn't enter white officers' clubs. Letters from home brought news of continuing discrimination, families facing Jim Crow laws, violence, and systemic oppression. They were fighting for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. Equipment remained an issue through 1944. While the 332nd eventually received P-51 Mustangs, the best American fighter of the war, they received them later than white units. Maintenance support was often inadequate. Replacement aircraft and parts arrived slowly. The message remained clear. Despite their proven combat record, they were still lower priority. The psychological toll was enormous. These men carried a burden white pilots didn't face. Every mission wasn't just about personal survival or military success. Every mission was about proving black Americans deserved equality. One failure, one mistake, one moment of weakness could be used to justify continued discrimination. The pressure was relentless and exhausting. And then there were the missions that went wrong. January 27, 1944, the 99th lost 3 pilots in a single engagement. March 31, 1944, the 100th Squadron lost 4 aircraft. These losses were comparable to white units, but they were scrutinized differently. When white squadrons lost pilots, it was the fortune of war. When the Red Tails lost pilots, critics questioned their competence. The myth that the Red Tails never lost a bomber would later become controversial. While their bomber loss rate was exceptionally low, bombers under their escort were occasionally shot down. The exaggeration, though well-intentioned, gave ammunition to critics who pointed to any discrepancy as evidence of dishonesty. The truth, that they had the best protection record in the theater, was impressive enough without embellishment. Yet one mission would prove why this aircraft and these men earned their place in history. March 24, 1945, the date that opened this story. The largest bombing raid of the war was about to begin. Over 1,600 American bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, would strike Berlin a round trip of 1,600 miles deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The 332nd Fighter Group received its orders: provide escort for the final leg into Berlin and back out. This was the mission every fighter pilot dreaded and desired. Berlin meant maximum danger, the Luftwaffe would defend the capital with everything they had, including their newest weapon, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. It could strike bomber formations, destroy multiple aircraft, and escape before escorts could react. Standard fighter tactics didn't work against jets. The 332nd took off from their base in Italy at dawn, 43 P-51 Mustangs with red tails gleaming in the morning sun. They climbed to 30,000 feet, joining the bomber stream over Austria. The formation stretched for miles, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s in tight combat boxes, silver in the high-altitude sun, contrails streaming behind them like frozen rivers. As they approached Berlin, the Luftwaffe struck. First came conventional fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s diving from altitude. The red tails engaged immediately, breaking left and right to intercept. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown found himself head-to-head with a Bf-109. Both aircraft fired simultaneously. The German fighter exploded. Brown pulled up hard, looking for the next threat. Then the jets came. 3 Me-262s moving at incredible speed, lining up on the bomber formation. This is where things took a dramatic turn. Brown spotted one jet setting up for an attack run. He pushed his throttle to maximum power and dove, trying to gain enough speed to intercept. The Me-262 was faster, but Brown had altitude advantage and a shorter distance to close. The jet pilot didn't see Brown coming until too late. Brown opened fire from 2,000 feet, walking his tracers toward the sleek gray aircraft. The Me-262 tried to accelerate away, but Brown's first burst hit home. The jet trailed smoke. Brown fired again. This time, the jet burst into flames and spun toward the ground below. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown had just shot down the Luftwaffe's most advanced fighter. Seconds later, Lieutenant Earl Lane spotted another Me-262 making a high-speed pass at the bombers. Lane timed his interception perfectly, catching the jet just as it began its attack run. His 6.50 caliber guns converged on the Me-262. The jet shuddered under the impact and dove away trailing fire. Lane had scored the second jet kill of the day. Captain Charles Brantley got the third. Brantley, leading his flight, saw a Me-262 pulling up after an attack run. The jet was climbing, using its speed to escape, but Brantley had positioned himself perfectly. He fired a long burst. The jet's right engine exploded. The Me-262 rolled inverted and went down. 3 of the Luftwaffe's most advanced fighters destroyed by red tail pilots. But the real achievement was the bombers. Every single B-17 and B-24 under 332nd protection made it to Berlin, dropped their bombs, and returned safely. Not one lost. On a mission where other groups lost multiple bombers to jets, the red tails brought everyone home. When the formation landed back in Italy that evening, the bomber crews climbed down from their aircraft and sought out the red tail pilots. They shook hands. They expressed gratitude. Some were in tears. These white airmen from all over America had been protected by black pilots who'd been told they couldn't fly. The irony was not lost on anyone. As the war progressed, the Tuskegee Airmen would continue to evolve. By spring 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen were operating at peak efficiency. The 332nd Fighter Group had become one of the most requested escort units in the 15th Air Force. Their reputation preceded them. Bomber crews knew that red tails meant protection, discipline, and the highest probability of survival. The aircraft they flew had evolved significantly. The P-51D Mustang, with its distinctive bubble canopy and 6.50 caliber machine guns, gave them performance equal to or better than anything the Luftwaffe could field. With drop tanks, the Mustang had range to escort bombers anywhere in Europe. The red tails that marked these aircraft became so famous that some Luftwaffe pilots reportedly avoided engagements when they spotted them. The missions expanded beyond bomber escort. The 332nd flew armed reconnaissance missions, hunting for targets of opportunity: trains, trucks, airfields. They conducted fighter sweeps, seeking out and destroying enemy aircraft. They flew ground attack missions, strafing German positions. The versatility they demonstrated put to rest any lingering questions about black pilots' capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., had been promoted to full colonel and continued commanding the 332nd. His leadership style emphasized discipline, precision, and mission focus. He didn't tolerate showboating or unnecessary risks. The result was a unit that performed consistently at the highest level. Under his command, The 332nd flew 15,533 sorties and 1,578 missions, more than any other fighter group of comparable size. But here's what made the late war period particularly significant. The 332nd became a laboratory for integration. White liaison officers assigned to work with the 332nd reported that integration worked smoothly. Bomber crews specifically requested red tail escorts regardless of the pilot's race. The combat effectiveness data was undeniable. The experiment that was supposed to fail had succeeded spectacularly. The kill totals mounted. By war's end, Tuskegee Airmen were credited with destroying 112 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They probably destroyed many more. Conservative confirmation requirements meant many kills went unrecorded. They destroyed another 150 aircraft on the ground during strafing runs. They demolished 950 railcars, damaged 619 locomotives, and sank or damaged numerous ships and boats. Individual achievements were remarkable. Captain Lee Archer finished the war with 4 confirmed kills and likely several more unconfirmed. He would later fight for recognition as one of the war's aces. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence, Lucky, Lester shot down 3 aircraft in a single mission. Captain Edward Toppins, Captain Wendell Prout, and Lieutenant Willie Ashley all achieved multiple kills. These men became heroes in black communities across America, though mainstream white media often ignored their accomplishments. The decorations told another story. The 332nd Fighter Group received the Distinguished Unit Citation for outstanding performance during bomber escort missions. This was one of the highest unit awards the military could bestow. Individual pilots received 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 744 Air Medals, 8 Purple Hearts, and 14 Bronze Stars. These weren't participation trophies. These were recognition of extraordinary courage and skill under combat conditions. Training at Tuskegee continued throughout the war, expanding beyond pilots to include navigators, bombardiers, and support personnel. The Tuskegee Army Airfield became a complete aviation training center. By war's end, 992 pilots had graduated from the program, along with thousands of support personnel. The infrastructure created for segregation, ironically, became a center of black excellence and achievement. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The 332nd Fighter Group flew its last combat mission on April 30th, a fitting end, as that was the day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. The racist ideology the Nazis had championed was defeated in part by the men America had claimed couldn't fight. The irony was profound. As peace came to Europe, the question became, what happens to the Tuskegee Airmen now? They'd proven beyond any doubt that black pilots could match white pilots in every measure of combat performance. They destroyed the scientific racism that military policy had been built upon. They'd earned the respect of bomber crews, fellow fighter pilots, and commanding officers. But would America in peacetime honor what they'd achieved in war? When the war ended in August 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a combat record that demolished every racist assumption the military had held. They'd flown 1,578 combat missions and 15,533 sorties. They destroyed 261 enemy aircraft, 112 in the air, 150 on the ground. They'd protected bomber formations so effectively that they became the most requested escort group in the theater. The numbers were undeniable. But the statistics don't capture what they accomplished beyond combat. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that the military's racial policies were based on prejudice, not fact. They demonstrated that given equal training and equipment, black Americans performed as well as anyone. They opened a door that would lead, eventually, to full military integration. The immediate post-war period was bittersweet. The pilots returned home as heroes in black communities. Parades celebrated them in Chicago, New York, Detroit. Black newspapers proclaimed their achievements. But in much of America, particularly the South, they returned to the same Jim Crow laws, the same discrimination, the same second-class citizenship they'd left behind. Some tried to continue flying. Commercial airlines wouldn't hire them. Private flying clubs excluded them. The skills they'd mastered, the combat experience they'd gained, meant nothing in a segregated society. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. remained in the newly independent U.S. Air Force. The Army Air Forces became the Air Force in 1947, but opportunities for advancement were limited by continuing racism. Then came July 26, 1948. President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating integration of the armed forces. The order didn't mention the Tuskegee Airmen by name, but their combat record had made integration inevitable. Military leadership could no longer credibly argue that black servicemen couldn't perform at the highest levels. The Tuskegee Airmen had provided the proof. Integration proceeded slowly, facing resistance from officers who clung to old prejudices. But it proceeded. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., became the Air Force's first black general in 1954. The 332nd Fighter Group was deactivated, its personnel integrated into previously all-white units. The experiment that was supposed to prove black inferiority had instead proven that segregation was a waste of talent and potential. The legacy extended beyond the military. Many Tuskegee Airmen became leaders in the civil rights movement. They'd proven their worth under fire. They'd earned respect from white Americans who'd fought alongside them. They used that credibility to push for equality at home. The discipline, courage, and determination they'd shown in combat they now applied to breaking down barriers in civilian life. Some became commercial pilots when airlines finally began hiring black aviators in the 1960s. Others became teachers, engineers, businessmen, politicians. They carried the Tuskegee legacy into every field they entered. The first generation of black astronauts included men who'd been inspired by the Tuskegee Airmen. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively. About 300 surviving airmen attended the ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda. They were in their 80s and 90s by then, but they stood straight in their uniforms, wearing their medals. The nation finally, officially, recognized what they'd accomplished. Today, only a handful of Tuskegee Airmen remain alive, but their legacy is preserved at museums, in history books, in the stories told to new generations of military pilots. The red tails they made famous are commemorated by Air Force units that maintain the tradition. Every black pilot, every black officer, every black general stands on the foundation the Tuskegee Airmen built. Looking back, the Tuskegee Airmen were more than just skilled pilots. They were pioneers who fought two wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany, one against American racism, and they won both. Their impact on World War II was measurable and significant. The 332nd Fighter Group's bomber protection record was among the best in the entire European theater. They destroyed enemy aircraft, disrupted supply lines, and protected American lives. But their strategic importance went beyond individual missions. They proved that the military's segregation policies were not just morally wrong but operationally wasteful. Thousands of qualified black Americans had been excluded from service roles they could have filled excellently. The technological and tactical innovations they brought were also noteworthy. The 332nd developed escort tactics that became standard procedure. Their disciplined approach to bomber protection, staying with the formation rather than chasing kills, influenced how other units operated. They demonstrated that mission success mattered more than individual glory, a lesson that resonated throughout the Air Force. But their greatest impact was social and political. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that racial integration could work under the most stressful conditions imaginable: combat. If black and white pilots could fight together effectively over Germany, they could work together anywhere. This logic became irrefutable after the war. Military integration led to broader civil rights progress. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 drew on arguments about equality that the Tuskegee Airmen had validated with their blood. The numbers tell part of the story. 992 pilots trained, 1,578 combat missions, 112 aerial victories, 150 distinguished flying crosses, 1 distinguished unit citation. But numbers can't capture the courage it took to volunteer for a program designed to fail. They can't measure the strength required to face discrimination at home and enemy fire abroad. They can't quantify the impact of proving, definitively, that racial prejudice has no basis in fact. The Tuskegee Airmen changed America. They showed that excellence transcends race. They demonstrated that diversity makes organizations stronger, not weaker. They proved that the content of one's character matters infinitely more than the color of one's skin. These lessons, paid for in blood over the skies of Europe, continue resonating today. Every time an Air Force pilot sees the red tail heritage markings on modern aircraft, they remember. Every time a black officer takes command, they stand on the foundation the Tuskegee Airmen built. The experiment that was supposed to prove inferiority instead proved the opposite and changed a nation forever. So there you have it, the complete story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the red tails who proved everyone wrong. From a segregated training program in Alabama designed to fail, through 1,578 combat missions over Europe, to becoming the most requested bomber escort group in the theater, these men proved that excellence knows no color. 992 pilots earned their wings at Tuskegee. They flew 15,533 combat sorties, destroyed 261 enemy aircraft, and protected bomber crews with unmatched dedication. They earned 150 distinguished flying crosses, 1 distinguished unit citation, and the eternal gratitude of the bomber crews they brought home safely. They remain one of the most important fighter groups in American history, not just for what they did in combat, but for what they changed at home. German pilots who laughed at the red tails learned respect the hard way. American bomber crews who'd grown up with segregation learned that the color of your escort's skin mattered far less than the skill they brought to the fight. And America learned that its racial policies were not just morally wrong but strategically foolish. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight for America, they fought to change America, and they succeeded. What impressed you most about this legendary group? Was it their combat record, their perseverance against discrimination, or the fact that they changed military policy forever? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WW2's greatest stories, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're covering the missions, the aircraft, and the people who changed history. Thanks for watching WW2 Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.